Hello, everybody. I want to introduce you to Lenny Bruce. That's him right there in this poster from way back. And I've dedicated Chutzpah and Soul to the memory of Lenny Bruce. That's been the case ever since this podcast had started years ago, a number of years ago. I only encountered Lenny Bruce after he had already died about 5 months before, through his book, his autobiography called How to Talk Dirty and Influence People. And that's a parody of Dale Carnegie's famous book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. I was only 16 and I was living and surviving and angry in Swampscott, Massachusetts. But my aunt and my cousin, my aunt and uncle and 2 cousins, lived in Lynn, which is much more of a working class place, in a city, it's a city next to Swampscott. My aunt Sue, or Sarah Sue, was a really interesting and lively and charismatic woman. And she turned me on to the book. She gave me the book and she had obviously read it. So I've got the book and I haven't started reading it yet. I guess I had just gotten it a few days before, but I'm at Swampscott High School and I'm going to a study hall class. Now study hall, you know, is a class where there's no teaching done. You're just supposed to bring your own stuff and study, but there is a teacher who's kind of a monitor. So I was starting to read that book, the autobiography, and I was laughing immediately. It starts out, I can't even repeat how it starts out, but it immediately starts out in a graphically hilarious and well-written book, chapter. The monitor, the teacher in charge, happened to be the most vicious teacher in that school. And of course, he was the assistant football coach. He was, I think, former Marine. He was a lifer. And his name was Frank DeFelice. But I changed that last name in a play, in a one-man show that I did about this. I changed it just a little bit to Frank DeFalco. I kind of like the way that sounds better. So Frank DeFalco asked me, come up to the front and give him the book. I don't think he came over to me and snatched it out of my hands. I think he asked me to leave it with him. So I had nothing else to study. So I just sat there for the rest of the period and I watched to see if he was gonna sneak, do something sneaky, like look at it. Like somebody in the past would look at Playboy magazine or something. But it didn't look like he did. However, he must have been more educated than I thought, because after the class, we're walking out into the hall, he hands me the book back, and he says, and I wish I could imitate that voice. He always talked in a scream, or in a really hoarse, angry type of voice. The opposite of, let's say, a late night jazz disc jockey, the opposite. And he says, Garland, do you know how Lenny Bruce died? And years later, spoiler alert, I wanted to say, yes, he died of an overdose of assholes like you. But of course I didn't say that. He had died of a heroin overdose. And I simply said, yeah. I can't remember what he said after that. But that line was the killer line. That was the killer line. Fast forward to San Francisco Bay Area, where I ended up living for 9 years, from 1985 to 1994. And there was every possible cultural expression in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's incredible. And it's always ahead of its time. So the idea of doing a one-person show, like a full, maybe as long as a regular theater thing, or maybe shorter, was popular, had become popular there. It was called Solo Mio, was the name of a festival of people doing solo performance shows. So one day I see a leaflet a flyer that says, Writers Who Act Workshop. I join it. And the director of it, the creator, founder, was this guy named Bill Talent. Incredibly talented guy, way outside the box. In fact, in this time and age, he's in New York organizing like these anarchist groups, not as political groups, but more as performance groups. And for a while he was doing this thing where he pretended to be a minister of some crazy named church. Anyway, he was a great director. And I started writing this story, which incorporates this, but also does other things. When I mentioned the name Swampscott, he couldn't get over how weird the name sounded, or how unusual it sounded. Of course, it's an Indian name. And he started riffing on it, and he finally came up with kumquat, that wonderful fruit from New Zealand. Kumquat, so the show was called Kumquat High, as in high school. And I recreated the Frank DeFalco situation. I recreated about Lenny Bruce. I recreated some of the asshole conversations I had in Swampscott with the kids that I was sort of hanging out with at that time. At the end of that show, I created a really amazing fantasy ending where I fly back from the West Coast to actually Swampscott. My parents were still living there at the time. And I think I saw in a local newspaper, I'm not sure if this is true, a photograph of Frank DeFalco on the basketball court yelling at some kid. Or maybe it was just him and this kid, but at least I felt that it was Frank DeFalco doing his shtick. It's amazing, though, that he would still be teaching there after all those years. All right, so maybe it's not true. But what I fantasized was that I was going to go find him, not to beat him up, obviously, but find him on the basketball court at Swampscott High School. And I was going to walk over in slow motion to the musical score from Chariots of Fire, great film around that time. And there was a very famous score, and it went something like da 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 da. So in slow motion, we actually had that music going on a tape, and there's Frank, and I think he's like in the imagination he's bullying this kid who's like about 16. And I walk up slowly to Frank, and I look him right in the eyes, and I say, Lenny's not dead. Lenny's not dead. And that's how the show ended.